Hi, guys. So once again, I said I was here with Mike. Mike has a PhD in New Testament from the University of Pretoria and completed all requirements with distinction and highest remarks there for that. He also worked in Liberty University on the resurrection with the great Gary Habermas, who was an inspiration to me as well. Mike has worked on 7 books, the major one being The Resurrection of Jesus, a Historiographical Approach, IVP Press, 2010, which I strongly recommend to you. He's also authored a multiplicity of other books like Paul Meets Muhammad, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, Behold, I Stand at the Door and Knock, and a bunch of other wonderful resources. I also recommend his website to you, which is The Risen Jesus, and a great podcast, which he does as well. All right. Well, with that said, let's go ahead and go through the passage. All right. So I'm here in Luke 24. In Luke chapter 24, which I'll show you here on the screen in a little bit, talks about the first day of the week when the disciples and his followers had, well, let me rewind there a little bit. So we're going to Luke 24. Mike, do you mind giving us an introduction to what's happening here as an overview of what we're getting into? I'll let you do it.
Sure. Well, Jesus is crucified on Friday, dies around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He's buried before sunset, which would have been the Jewish custom. You know, here's something of interest. Historically speaking, you'll have some skeptics like John Dominic Cross and Bart Ehrman and some others who have said that Jesus would not have received a proper burial. Instead, he would have been removed from the cross and thrown into a common grave where dogs and scavengers would have fed off of his corpse. But we have a text in Josephus, which states that just a couple of years prior to the temple being destroyed. So we're talking probably the late 60s now, 67, 68. And it says that the Romans sent some mercenaries into Jerusalem. They killed some of the Jews, and they did not allow for them to be buried. And it says the Jews were infuriated over this because it had been their custom to remove the crucified from their crosses and give them a proper burial prior to sunset. So here we have Josephus saying that the being fed to dogs and thrown in a common grave, although that was a typical practice throughout the Roman Empire, it would not have been in Jerusalem at that time. We also have archaeological evidence that would suggest or back up that interpretation of Josephus, because there are a couple of ossuaries that have been discovered. One in particular, Yehohanan, in the late 1960s, was discovered a bone box, an ossuary, that contained his skeletal remains with a crucifixion nail still embedded in his ankle. So we know that Yehohanan had been crucified. Ossuaries were used between the years 30 BC and when the temple was destroyed in 70, so only within that 100-year period. So this was prior to the year 70, and there you have an executed guy, an executed Jew who had been crucified, who had been removed from the cross and provided a proper burial. So the gospel accounts turn out to be reliable here. We can verify the reliability against the claims of skeptics.
Wow, thank you, brother. That's amazing. And so we can verify that using collaborative evidence for other historical events at the time, in addition to and external to the Gospels. All right, with that said, then let's go to the verses. So Luke 24, on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared. Early dawn, so we're talking about on, was it Sunday morning?
Yes.
So Jesus had already risen on Saturday, on the Sabbath. Is that correct? Go ahead and break that down for us. What happened here?
Yeah, well, he said he'd be raised on the 3rd day, so that's probably Sunday sometime he's raised. Because and the Romans, I mean, there's a number of things we can say about the 3-day thing, because typically, we're looking at 36 hours here, 36 to 40 hours rather than 3 24-hour days. And you've got the sign of Jonah, 3 days, 3 nights. But the 3-day motif was a figure of speech, much like today we might say, well, that'll take forever when it will only take 3 hours. Or just give me a minute. That could mean 10 minutes, So these are temporal figures of speeches. The 3-day motif, 3 days, 3 nights, 3-day motif was used in the Akkadian medical literature, meaning a short period of time. Moreover, the Romans used an inclusive manner of counting. Like if it said January 23rd, it wouldn't say the 23rd of the month of January. It would say, I don't remember the word that they use in Latin right now, but you've got the Ides, which is pretty much the middle of the month, and I think there's another for the end of the month, and there's one for the beginning of the month, and it would say, like 8 days from the first of the month, and that they'd go back, and that would be how they would say, the 23rd of January, because they would include the 1st of January, the 1st of February. That would be included in there, and so would the 23rd of January. So when you're looking at 3 days, they would include Friday and Sunday if the Jews were counting in the same way. So it's a short period of time. Jesus would have been raised on Sunday sometime, but we don't know exactly when.
Well, definitely before they showed up, because it's early dawn.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay. So when the early church talks about and the Christians today and skeptics actually raise that problem of Friday, Saturday, and Sunday is not actually 3 literal days. As you say, it's a figure of speech, a hyperbolic way of determining a period of time. Right. What happened there with Jonah, which I was reading with my mother the other day, the story of Jonah. It's fascinating. So Jesus was mimicking that in his communication to people regarding going into the earth and coming back. All right. So what about the spices, Mike? What are they taking spices for?
Well, that would have been, he would have received an honorable burial if you had the spices, of course. And it would be to, cover up a lot of the stench from a decaying body.
Mm. Today, the other day, we went, keeping the social distance, to one of my cousins who passed away 2 days ago. And we went to a funeral, and there was the outside area. And then a lot of the ladies gathered, and they had a lot of spices with them. And they had some kind of sweets, and they poured them over the grave as a tradition of what was done from Jesus to Jesus, waiting for the return of that loved one.
Mm.
Even today, that's still being done. Verse 2, and they found the stone rolled away from the tomb.
Sure. Well, some skeptics have, like Richard Carrier and some just a couple of others have said that this would have been inaccurate because the stones would have been square, not round. You wouldn't have round stones. However, there have been other studies, like, for example, Rachel Hachlili had written a book published by Brill, I think it was 2003, but I'm not sure, about ancient funerary and burial practices in the Second Temple period. Mm-hmm. I forgot the name of the title of the book, but it's something like that. And she was able to locate no less than 6 round stones in Jerusalem, dated to the 1st century. So,
how large are these stones?
How
large are these stones?
I don't know, but they would have. I've been to Jerusalem twice now. I've seen some tombs, and you really got it to stoop in front of some of them, like those by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's a very, very small entrance. You really have to stoop to climb through it. The Garden Tomb, which is probably not the authentic tomb of Jesus, but the Garden Tomb, the entrance to that is a little larger. Either way, the stone would have been very, very heavy, very heavy. But it wouldn't have been something that would have been it probably wouldn't have been greater than 5 feet tall, may not even been more than 4 feet tall.
Okay. All right, let's move on. But when they went in, they did not find the body of Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, behold, 2 men stood by them in dazzling apparel. Some texts say in lightning-like apparel.
Yeah, well, actually, if I remember right, I don't have my Greek text in front of me, but if I remember correctly, yeah, that would the lightning-like would be what the Greek term actually seems to suggest there. Now, some skeptics have said, see, this is a conflict, a discrepancy, because this says 2 men, mm-hmm. whereas The other Gospels say angels. Well, Matthew and John say angels. Mark says a young man. But here's the thing. Elsewhere in Scripture and in Jewish literature, angels are sometimes described as men or young men. It is the white clothing here that gives it away that it's an angel.
Hmm. So when the scriptures talk about angels among us, is it possible even today to have people who look like normal people helping us or serving who are actually servants of God, transcendently speaking?
Sure, I don't see why not.
Wow. I guess the reverse can be done with the demonic. Maybe they can take on form, but maybe we shouldn't go there now.
Well, yeah, perhaps as a demon-possessed person, right?
Yeah.
You know, we know that, I mean, in third world countries, it's pretty prevalent. We see it in Scripture, too, and I believe that there are demon-possessed people here in the U.S.
Hmm. And I'm convinced that one of the devil's greatest successes is making people believe he doesn't exist via materialism and naturalism.
I agree with you.
All right, moving on. And as they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, and this is one of my favorite verses of all time, "Why do you seek the living among the dead?"
Mm. Yeah, the fact that they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground is another item that would suggest that they recognized that these two figures were angelic in nature.
Mm-hmm. Before they even spoke, they just hit the floor.
Yeah.
That seems to be a common theme among the scriptures when one encounters the divine or a theophany or of some sort. A fear.
Yeah.
Fear. Mike, right now a lot of people are in fear, right? People in maybe even phobia type fear regarding the situation of the corona issue. Is there a distinction between the fear that God gives us, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the fear that people can have over pandemics or unknown situations and xenophobia? How do we wrap ourselves around the concept of fear, scripturally speaking, as a healthy thing as opposed to an unhealthy type of fear?
Yeah, I suppose there is a difference there. I'm not a psychologist to be able to talk about those things, but I suppose if you're in the presence of God, this is an angel we're talking about here, but if you're in the presence of God or of an angel that just is so much more powerful than you are, that you just have no control, no chance whatsoever against such, that should strike fear into you. I mean, Jesus even said about, don't fear those who can kill the body, but can do nothing else, but fear the one who can kill the body and destroy both body and soul in hell. And yeah, so God is certainly something to be feared and respected in that sense.
Okay, but not terrified of. If you are right with God and you are walking in the principles He has put forward and cleansed by the blood of Christ, that fear should be a healthy fear. But if you're not, it makes sense to fear Him, like maybe Peter said to Jesus when he met Him, "Go away from me, I am a sinful man." The terror is too much. Or Job falls on the floor in dust and ash before God. Yeah. All right, so then it says the scriptures, He is not here, He has risen. Remember how He told you while He was still in Galilee. And they're reminding them there, He told you He was going to do this.
That's right. And in Mark 14:28, you've got, well, even throughout all the Gospels, you have Jesus on a number of occasions predicting His imminent death and resurrection. In Mark 14:8, He does say that He's going to rise from the dead and then go ahead of them to Galilee where they will see Him.
So some of the skeptical responses to this are that the end passage in Mark, which is the earliest gospel, was actually extrapolated or put on there later on by other scribes. That Jesus' resurrection was something that was added later on during Christian history. It wasn't part of the original motif. And you take issue to that, don't you?
Well, of course. You've got Paul writing. We don't know exactly when when Mark was written. It's probably somewhere between the years 50 and 70. The majority of scholars place it 50 to 70, and you can narrow it even further to between 65 and 70 AD. But Paul's writing his letters, let's say, to the church at Corinth, 1 Corinthians. He's writing that somewhere between 53 and 56. And he says in chapter 15, verse 1, or verse 3, I delivered to you what I also received. And then in verses, the rest of the remainder 3 through 7, he delivers to them an oral tradition that had been passed along to him from the Jerusalem apostles. But when he says, I delivered to you what I had also received, he's referring to back when he established the church in Corinth, which would have been around the year 51. And then he received it prior to then, right? So we've got something that Paul received from the apostolic leadership somewhere between the time of Jesus' resurrection and the year 50. And of course, the content of that is coming from the alleged eyewitnesses. So even though we don't know when Paul received this in its creedal formula, the content would go back extremely early, that Christ died, was buried, was raised, and he appeared to individuals and to groups. And this comes long before Mark's gospel would have been written. So you wouldn't say that the resurrection was an invention because Mark doesn't narrate the appearances. He does narrate the resurrection insofar as Jesus' tomb is empty. The angels have announced his resurrection, and they've also referred back to his prediction about his resurrection in 14:28, where he says that after he has been raised, he's going to go ahead of them into Galilee, and there they will see him. And now the angel in verse 7 reminds them of this, of what he said to them back in 14:28. So yeah, it wasn't an invention because it's earlier.
Much earlier. Well said there with Paul as well, documenting that creed. So the skeptical postulation that the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth being, Ehrman talks about this as well, how Christians made the man Jesus into the God Jesus later on in history. Because of the growth of mythology that is put on the historical context of any major figure, becomes a messiah type of figure, and there's a lot of legend that grows around him. I remember I was talking to a couple a number of years ago who said on their honeymoon they wanted to go to England to visit Camelot and meet King Arthur. I said, what? Talk about a mixing of mythology and history, right? Maybe even pull out Excalibur, from the Lady of the Lake too, if you want to do that. But there's a problem there, and there's some truth that we have to address. Sometimes historical figures are given these magical properties, like the Buddha is called, a bunch of things are added to him later on, or Muhammad, for example, parting the moon. Later on, there's stories added to the historical figures. Why do we say Jesus with him, the evidence is solid that that did not happen?
Well, there's a number of reasons. Historians would use common sense criteria or principles. We're going to put more weight on a report if the report is early. That is, it's written, close to the event it's purporting to describe. If it's reported by an alleged eyewitness, that's going to have a little more weight behind it than if it's reported by someone 3 or 4 removed. If it's reported by multiple independent sources, especially if those sources are early, that's going to count heavily. If it's reported by unsympathetic sources, that's going to count quite heavily. And we have all that kind of stuff when it comes to things about Jesus. A lot of these other legendary characters don't have that.
Wow.
Like, for example, Krishna.
Yeah.
The earliest mention of Krishna we have in the historical record is an inscription in a stone that's dated somewhere between 500 and 600 BC. And yet the Bhagavad Gita that mentions Krishna is allegedly of a war that took place around the year 3000 BC. So we're looking at 24 to 2500 years later as our first mention of Krishna in the historical report. And in contrast, this oral tradition we have about Jesus in 1 Corinthians 15, dates back, within 20 years, and the reports that the data that are behind that creed go back even earlier. Plus, we have all 4 Gospels written within 65 years of the event itself. So, the stuff that we have is far better than other religions and many other myths out there.
Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the third day rise. The term is Son of Man there, and then about the sinful men, third day. There's a lot in that verse. Anything there, or we can...
Well, yeah, throughout Luke's gospel, throughout Mark's gospel, John, Matthew, we find Jesus predicting his death and resurrection on several occasions. You find it in Mark chapter 8, verses 31 through 33, where Jesus predicts his death and resurrection. Peter rebukes Jesus, saying this can't happen. And Jesus turns around and rebukes Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan."
Wow.
That has an embarrassing quality to it, because at this point when Peter would have been the leader among the apostles, and when Mark is written, he may have even been leader of the church at that point, or at least the once leader of the church before James, or it may even be the case he had been executed, but he would have still been held in extremely high regard. So why would you invent something so embarrassing to the leader, where you have Peter actually rebuking Jesus? So you have that. You've got it in Mark 9, where Jesus is predicting his death. You've got it at the Last Supper, where Jesus is predicting his death. In Matthew and Luke, you have the sign of Jonah prediction, where Jesus is predicting his death and resurrection. So it's all over. You have recurrent attestation throughout the Gospels. And here the angels are simply reminding the women of those predictions, and that Jesus said he was going to rise from the dead.
And this is what we're doing now, brother, reminding people of his resurrection and hope for all of us through this time, that he'll get us through it. He'll be there for us. Talk about, Mike, a little bit. The angels refer to the Son of Man. I mean, there's so much written on this issue. Why did they call him the Son of Man rather than the Son of God?
Well, Son of Man can be used in a number of different senses. It can be used just as a self-referent. We don't do this today and talk about ourselves as the Son of Man. It's kind of almost like saying the Son of Adam. Okay. We're the Son of Man. You're just referring to human. That's one way, or you're referring to yourself, a self-referent. But it wasn't so odd in antiquity. Polybius, one of the great historians of antiquity, 2nd century BC, he often refers to himself in the third person. Julius Caesar wrote his entire commentary on the Civil War in the third person, refers to himself always in the third person. In the Gospel of John, the author may be referring to himself in the third person. So for Jesus to refer to himself in the Son of Man as in third person, no big deal. There's another way in which Son of Man can be used, and in which Jesus does use it on occasion, and that is when referring to a divine Son of Man, apocalyptic figure that's mentioned in Daniel chapter 7. The Son of Man will be presented before the Ancient of Days, God, and God will subject everything to him, so that every tribe, every people, and language will worship and serve him. That's really, really strong, because elsewhere it says that God will share his glory with no one, and we are to worship God and serve him only. And yet God commands that we serve Jesus, or the Son of Man, in Daniel 7, and throughout the Gospels, especially in Mark. Right. You've got Jesus referring to himself as the apocalyptic divine Son of Man in this sense, like in chapter 10, I believe it's verses 25, 26, something like that, where it's talking about he'll come on the clouds and with power and glory, or with the holy angels. And then in Mark 14, verses 61 through 64, he's obviously referring to himself as this divine apocalyptic Son of Man in Daniel 7. And that's why the high priest tears his clothes and charges Jesus of blasphemy. Because if he wasn't truly the Son of Man described in that divine apocalyptic sense, it would have been blasphemy.
This is.
So, yeah.
So when Jesus says you, he tells, was it Caiaphas, the high priest, you shall see the Son of Man coming in power and glory. As there's some things done there regarding preterism and the end times prophecies and the apocalyptic work done on that. Being in 70 AD when the Jerusalem was sacked and destroyed, over 1 million Jews were killed. Could that be what Jesus was referring to, the coming of the Son of Man in that way, or is this something else that he's saying that he will see this happening?
Yeah, it could certainly be that way. I study more of the historical stuff than the theological. I tend to think of myself as a partial preterist, but I just don't spend a whole lot of time on this. I did years ago. I spent time on it, but I haven't in recent years. But yeah, I think he could very well be referring to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem.
Interesting, fascinating. Yeah, I recommend the work of N.T. Wright on this. It's been helpful to me, although I'm still working through it myself. Okay, moving on. Third day, let's see, sinful man, he will die. Okay, and verse 8 now. And they remembered his words. Oh, that is so powerful, Mike. They remembered his words. How important it is for us to remember. Mm-hmm. Important us to keep having these little festivities, and even the local priest at our parish here recommended families walk around their home the way the churches do and take pictures together as a family, even dress up as a family and to have an Easter meal together just to remember and commemorate the day. So easy just to let it. One of the common themes we hear out there is, oh, every day is a special day. But I think when you make every day a special day, no day becomes one. Is that the case?
Yeah. Good point.
Especially with birthdays and great events. And, we have to set up that Ebenezer, that time of remembering. And God keeps telling us in the scriptures over and over again, remember, remember, remember. Verse 9, and returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest.
The 11.
The 11, yeah, the 11. Why 11 and not 12? I guess we could get into that. And the rest, this is the rest. There may be others with them. So go ahead.
Yeah. Well, there are a number of differences between the way the Gospels report things, and I think we can see some compositional devices going on here, and this one seems clear to me. So why 11? Why not the 12? Well, first of all, Judas is not there, right? He's hanged himself. He's dead. So that would be 11. But there's still a problem, because in John's Gospel, it reports that Thomas wasn't there for the initial one. So there would have actually been 10 of the original 12, and then there would have been others involved, like the women and some of the others, minor disciples who had been following Jesus, perhaps. So what's going on here? Well, Luke has collapsed everything. He's compressed everything to occur on Easter Sunday. So in Luke's gospel, you have the resurrection, all of the appearances, and the ascension happen on one day. He's compressed things. His is the longest of the gospels, and typically a scroll can only fit so many words, maybe 25,000 max. Mm-hmm. And he is approaching the maximum here. Luke is. So he may have compressed it for the sake of economy. He may have also done it just for dramatic purposes, or he may have done it because he's wanting the focus to be on Jerusalem, where the church is going to be headquartered, from which the church will be headquartered. We can only speculate, but Luke is certainly doing something here. And we know it's not a mistake on Luke's part. He's actually doing something. And the reason we know this is because Luke wrote a sequel to his gospel, the book of Acts. And in chapter 1, he says that Jesus appeared to his disciples for a period of 40 days. So he's aware that it happened over a shorter period of time, but he's narrating everything as though it happened on Easter. So in order to do that, he's got to take, and he is situating this first appearance to the group of male disciples in Jerusalem. Now, it may have happened in Jerusalem. This is one of the things I'm not sure what's going on here. I can't figure this out. Mark, followed by Matthew, situate the first appearance to the male disciples in Galilee. But you've got John, he puts it in Jerusalem. We can understand why Luke does it in Jerusalem, because everything happens in Jerusalem on Sunday. So it's got to be there. But it's 8 days later that he appears to his disciples and Judas.
Mhm.
But you can see in this text, not Judas, I'm sorry, and Thomas.
Thomas,
But
yeah,
you can see in this text that Thomas is present because he appeared to the 11, but it's as though he appeared to them for the first time. So
Mhm.
there's also a conflation of events that's going on.
Okay.
Luke conflates the two appearances to the group of male disciples narrated in John's gospel. The first two, he conflates them in this one as a single one. And this stuff would have been entirely allowable in ancient biography.
Which you have adequately written about in the Gospel Contradictions. What was the name of the book? The other one?
Why are there differences in the Gospels?
Why are there differences in the Gospels, which I recommend to you all. All right, moving on. But these words, let's see, the woman who were with them, okay, verse 10 is where I am. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Jonah and Mary, the mother of James, and the other woman with them who told these things to the apostles. How many Marys were there, Mike?
Well, that's a good question. In fact, in the appendix of that book to which you just referred, I've got an appendix on the women that went to the tomb, the women that were at the crucifixion. It's very difficult. But yes, there were several Marys. You see, back then, people were naming their children after heroes of the Hasmonean revolt that brought about the liberation of Israel from the Seleucid kingdom, from which Hanukkah is celebrated. So that's why you've got what is it? I think Simon is the number one male Jewish name in Palestine at that time. It's like one in every, I don't know, 7 Jewish males in Palestine were named that. In Roman Judea at that time were named Simon. Same, and then Joseph, Jesus, which would have been Joshua, Joseph, Joshua, Lazarus. These were very, very popular male Jewish names. Well, Mary, approximately 1 in every 5 Jewish women who lived in Roman Judea at that time were named Mary.
Wow.
So,
I used to work on that.
so
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish.
yeah, you're going to find a lot of Marys around. It's an extremely popular name.
I was working at American Airlines for a while, and we got on a plane once looking for a Mary Gonzalez. Oh boy, it was a plane going to Mexico City.
How many?
Almost every woman on the plane had Mary or Maria in her passport name.
Wow.
But it is one of the most popular female names in the world, and however, a very wonderful, powerful, humble woman, the mother of Jesus. The women stayed together, which was important, even for us today to stay together, isn't it, Mike? Do you have a word to say to people today regarding staying together, even if there's a social distance?
Oh, okay. So you kind of faded out a second. So the women were sticking together.
Yeah, well, the disciples were together during this difficult time, and then the women stayed together, and they went to the tomb together, and they came back together. The importance of not being alone, especially during difficulties. Like, for example, now we're forced to be away from other people, but even though we're closer to our family, we can still interconnect with people with social media, etc. But why is it so important that people stay connected to others?
Well, I mean, some of the obvious things for safety, for fellowship, for encouragement, and things back then are in the first century a little different than they are for us today. There were a lot of danger as well, and there was a lot that had to do with the community. You needed a community in order for support for the family during rough times and things like that, because you took care of yourselves. That's why Paul in 1 Corinthians, when he says for the man who is being immoral, having sex with a stepmother, that they were to put him out. They were to excommunicate him, and not just him, but anyone who was acting in a sexually immoral way. They were not even to eat with such a person. That excommunication was a lot more effective back then than it would be today. Today, if you get excommunicated from a church, you just walk down the street and join another one, right? Wow. Who will tolerate your sinful lifestyle. But back then, it's not like there were a whole lot of churches There might have been one in a city. So if you're fellowshipping with other believers and you got excommunicated, now you were, this is an honor shame society. You have been shamed. You have no support. You are on your own. It was a lot more effective way of getting someone to repent.
So being alone is a form of punishment, and as we do with prisoners in solitary confinement. So the key is not to punish yourself when you're going through a difficult time, but to be with people, because being alone is actually one of the essential qualities of hell, isn't it? Eternal aloneness, away from the presence of God.
Yeah. Now, whether we'll be with others isn't really stated, but well, I shouldn't say we. I don't want to be there. You don't want to be there. But those who have been condemned,
Yes.
Eternally separated from God. Whether they'll be separated from others, who knows? But maybe the others you're with, you may not want to be with.
No, you don't. Well, the key is here in the text that we're getting at is you need other people. And the scriptures do command us to not forsake the gathering together of the saints, right? Verse 11, but these words seem to them like idle tales. Seems like what the skeptics are saying, this entire resurrection story is an idle tale. But they did not believe them. They didn't even believe this woman. Why would they not? Well, it seems obvious they wouldn't believe them. They say a man rose from the dead. It would be obvious to say, of course, that doesn't happen. I mean, normally speaking.
Yeah, and this is interesting. We were talking about some criteria a few moments ago about unsympathetic sources, multiple independent sources, eyewitness, early sources. Well, here's an embarrassing testimony or source. In the first century, women were not regarded as equals in any sense. So, I mean, their place within society was certainly not on par with men.
Still, a lot of parts of the world today, that's the case too.
It is. You're correct. But this is evident here. It says, you've got Josephus who says that the testimony of a woman was about as valuable as that of a thief, a robber. You've got the Talmud saying, better the law be burned than be placed in the hands of a woman. Wow. Blessed are the man whose children are male, and woe to him whose children are female. So in light of this, here's the point. If you're going to invent a story about a resurrection and an empty tomb, a story that's already going to be extremely difficult to believe, why would you make it compound that by making your primary witnesses women? And you can see how even the low status of women, or say lower status, lower than men, the lower status of women is seen here, because it says when the women reported this, the men thought they were telling frivolous tales. They didn't believe the women. So that's kind of interesting.
That is fascinating. This issue about the woman telling the tales and them not believing the woman, it's fascinating to me that Jesus would choose the woman to reveal the most epoch thing he possibly did, which was his resurrection from the dead, his conquering over death, to woman, contrary to my feminist friends who would attack the scriptures and saying that this is a patriarchal document pushing women down and causing them to be silent and crushed under the feet of the patriarchs. Well, no, women were used and honored so much that he showed himself to them first.
That's correct. And notice what else is going on. Why is he showing them? Why is he showing himself to them first? Because the men are hiding out of fear. So you have like two elements of embarrassing testimony here that you just wouldn't invent if you're inventing the story.
Well said, brother. Concluding this particular section, it says, but Peter rose and ran to the tomb, stooping and looking in. So it goes back to what you're saying. It's a smaller tomb. It's you have to dig down and stoop to get into it.
Yeah, and they probably weren't as tall as we are today, too.
Granted. He saw the linen cloths by themselves, and he went home marveling at what happened. My mother said she was there and visiting the tomb, and they still have something like a makeshift cloths that are set up behind some kind of glass that people can see. What about verse 12 about Peter running, stooping, and the cloths themselves? Is this something to do with the
The
Shroud of
shroud?
Turin, or is that something completely different?
No, I think it does has something that could be the Shroud of Turin. I mean, look, the Shroud of Turin, it's a controversial artifact. All right, and I mean, we can get into it if you want. I can share some things. Gary Habermas is more the expert on this.
Mhm.
Barry Schwartz, who was the official photographer of the Shroud of Turin for the Stirp team back in the 70s, the late 70s. He's Jewish and not a Christian believer. He's kind of an agnostic. Okay, I've talked to him. In fact, David Beck and I have recently co-edited a Festschrift for Gary Habermas. Barry Schwartz contributed an essay for it. It's coming out this summer or fall.
All right, look forward
And
to it.
Schwartz points out many problems with the carbon-14 testing, which has been to date the only thing that would suggest the Shroud of Turin is not authentic. Everything else seems to suggest its authenticity, that it would date back to the first century and may very well have belonged to Jesus.
Do you think it's authentic?
So- Hmm?
Do you think it's authentic?
Well, I'm not an expert on it, but from what I've read, from what my discussions with Gary Habermas, yeah, I do tend to think that it's authentic.
So the image
And-
there is possibly how the Semitic Jesus would have actually looked like.
That's right. About 5'10", pretty well built. So, and you know, as Gary would say, if the Shroud of Turin is authentic, we actually have a photograph of the resurrection. How's that for physical evidence for the if someone wants to ask you for physical evidence, you can say that to them.
Okay,
If the Shroud of Turin
for those
is
who don't know,
authentic,
tell
we
us how
actually
that
have a
works.
photograph.
Well, how is it a photograph?
What's
I
that?
heard something about light and photo and the heat from the light. Go for it. Go for it. This is fascinating.
Well, it would be the radiation that would have come from the body with because it is not. It is a scorch. It is a scorch on the shroud. It is not paint. That's something that the Stirp team, the Shroud of Turin research project team, found when they spent time with this back in the late 1970s. There are no brush strokes. There's no seeping of ink down into the shroud. It is not paint. So how did it? And it's a negative. We don't, young folks don't understand what a negative is today necessarily because they never had to experience film. And now they just take pictures
Digital.
with their iPhone or a nice camera. But when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, you didn't have this. Even in the 80s, you didn't have it. You used film in the camera, and then you took that film to a processing center or a Walmart or Costco, and you gave it to them. They processed it. You came back an hour or a couple hours or a few days later, and you picked up your photographs, and the negatives were in there. And the negatives are the exact opposite of what the photograph looks like. So if something like my shirt that I'm wearing would, these blue HBU letters would be probably white, and the orange would be a very dark color. So that's what we have with the Shroud of Turin. It is a negative. So you've got it's a negative. There's no brush strokes. There's no paint on it. The nail prints are not in the palms as we find in all medieval paintings of Jesus. They're in the wrists. And subsequent studies have found that if you put it on cadavers, that if you put and hung a person on a cross in the palm, there's nothing there to hold it and tear through. But you put it in the wrist, it would stay there. So it's there. You've got pollen that they have found on Jesus' head that would match that comes from the plant of the crown of thorns that made the crown from which the crown of thorns was made. There's also pollen found throughout the body that is indigenous to Jerusalem around that time of the year in the spring. You have clay dirt on the bottom of the feet that was found on the shroud in that position that is like the caves that we find, the tombs that we find in Jerusalem. You've got coins on the eyes that are like pilot coins that would have been there for Jerusalem. You also have the body that's in rigor mortis. Now, rigor mortis is when the body returns to the position in which it died when it dies a violent death. And so the legs are bent up, the thumbs are in, which they have found that on cadavers, if you put a nail there, the thumbs would come in. So you've got these kinds of things on the shroud. You've got x-rays of the teeth that have only recently been, they see these, but it's been recently concluded that it's only within the last decade or two that we have machines that can produce the kind of x-rays of teeth that we find on the shroud. So there's all kinds of things on the Shroud of Turin that would suggest its authenticity.
Wow, that is remarkable. Serendipitously so. Just especially on this resurrection day, they say that there's a photographic images that we can testify to in the shroud.
Yeah,
so,
even today we can't. We don't know. Even today with our technology, we don't know how to reproduce the image like that.
Imagine that, some kind of nuclear force of some sort was so powerful to fill his body with energy, reanimate it, and give him all his body life back into a whole new flesh. And that image was so strong and so hot that it pulled the negative of it on the cloth itself. That one little verse in verse 12, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. There's so much work just done on this. This is and he went home marveling, it says. And we could still marvel today, right, Mike?
Well, we do, don't we? And we read this and we can marvel, but I've looked over the years, I've spent a considerable amount of time looking at the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Yeah. And it really is remarkable what we have. It really is.
Let's give an overview then of the road to Emmaus, and we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll start landing this plane. All right, Mike, the road to Emmaus is the next section of chapter 4. So in the next few minutes, go ahead and give us an overview of what happened on that road to Emmaus, and then we'll go ahead and conclude.
Well, we're not exactly sure where Emmaus was. We haven't known, even back in the 4th century, we weren't even certain. Luke says that it was just shy of 7 miles outside of Jerusalem, okay? And what we have, though, is you've got 2 disciples of Jesus. These would have been minor disciples, okay? One is named Cleopas, the other is anonymous, and they're walking along the road, and Jesus comes up to them, and it says their eyes were kept from recognizing him, which is kind of interesting. So they're talking, and Jesus joins them, starts walking with them, and he's playing with them. I think this is just kind of funny. Every time I read it, I just got to smile. It's like he's just playing with them. He's keeping them from recognizing him.
If I may, Mike, today, even God has kept some people's eyes from seeing him too for his own purposes, right?
Yep.
Go ahead.
So here, finally, Jesus says, "Well, why the long faces, guys? What's going on?" And the one of them says, "Well, are you the only one in Jerusalem that doesn't know the things that have gone on here?" And Jesus says, "What?" He's playing with, "No, tell me what's going on here." And so they said, "Well, this Jesus, we thought he was the Messiah, prophet, but the Romans killed him. They crucified him the other day. But our women folk went to the tomb this morning and said they saw angels who had said he'd been raised from the dead. And then some of our own went to the tomb and found it as the women had said." So 2 things here. Number one, when you read the parallel text of the resurrection narrative in John's gospel, you've got, first of all, you have Mary. It says Mary Magdalene got up early, went to the tomb, and came back. And after she found it empty, she ran back, found Peter and the beloved disciple, and said, "They've taken the Lord, and we don't know where they've laid him." So, and then it says, so first of all, Luke has multiple women, whereas John only mentions Mary Magdalene. And then John's gospel says Peter and the beloved disciple got up and ran to the tomb and found it as she had said, whereas Luke says Peter got up and ran to the tomb. So you got 2 little discrepancies going on here. But here's an interesting thing.
How do we make sense of those?
Well, first of all, Mary Magdalene comes back and says they have taken the Lord and we don't know where they've laid him.
Hmm.
Who's we, right?
Mhm.
And I don't think it would be Peter and John because she's just telling them about it. And literary spotlighting, where you shine your spotlight on a particular person, the main person that's doing action, you're aware of others are there, but you don't you don't mention them. We find this Matthew and Mark have one angel at the tomb, Luke and John have two. They're probably doing literary spotlighting, Matthew and Mark, because they're only focused on the angel who's doing the announcement. You've got Mary come back. They've taken the Lord, and we don't know where they've laid him. John is shining a literary spotlight on Mary because she's the main one of the women there. And then, is it Peter or is it both? Well, Luke is shining his literary spotlight on Peter and doesn't mention the beloved disciple. Well, how do we know that that's the case? Well, you just go 12 verses later in Luke 24:24. And it said that this is when Jesus is talking to the Emmaus disciples, and it says that the women came back and told us they'd seen angels who had announced that he was dead or risen from the dead. And then it says, some of our own, plural, went to the tomb and found it as the women had said. Well, Luke, 12 verses earlier, you said that just Peter went to the tomb. And Luke would say, I didn't say just Peter. I only mentioned Peter, but I'm obviously aware that others were there because I said some of our own went to the tomb. So that's kind of interesting. We can see these discrepancies are easily resolved. Luke, John, they're just using compositional devices, the same kind of stuff that we use in our everyday conversation. Okay. The final thing I'd point out about this is that you have some skeptics, just a few of them, like Stephen Patterson of the Jesus Seminar and some others, that would say that the resurrection appearances were invented in order to confer authority on the percipients. In other words, Jesus never appeared to anyone, but they invented appearances of Jesus to give authority to the person who said that they saw Jesus. Okay. Well, consider this. What about the appearance to the women? We don't know of any of those women who had positions of authority in the early church. What about in the early creed in 1 Corinthians 15? He appeared to more than 500. We don't know of any group of more than 500 to whom authority was given in the early church. And even in this text of the Emmaus disciples in Luke, we don't know anything of Cleopas outside of this passage. Nothing, much less known about him being a leader. And then why the other disciple, Emmaus disciple, is anonymous? Why would you invent an appearance to confer authority on someone and then proceed to neglect to mention his name? It wouldn't make sense. So these appearances weren't in the Gospels, were not invented. Were not invented. Okay, well said.
So, all right, so now let's go ahead and wrap this up then, Mike. So much has been said, so much remarkable theological and exegetical work here we can continue working on. But so much is what you said is encouraging. Let's wrap up. I'm going to conclude then with a couple verses, maybe take your comment on it, and wish people a pleasant day here. And this is Jesus talking at Luke 24, verse 20, going to verse 24 and wrap it up from there. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but him they did not see, as you indicated to us. And 25, and he said to them, all foolish ones and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? It was necessary that he suffered. It was necessary for some of us sometimes to go through the hard times that we have to go through. We have to go through our own valley of the shadow of death in order for us to receive the glory that God has prepared for us on an individual level, as Christ is the ultimate model for him, and his vicarious death and resurrection from the dead gives us ultimate hope. And I encourage all of you with that don't forget, remember what the things that were written, and let's not be slow of heart to disbelieve what the prophets have written. Any final comments about that, Michael?
No, I think you've covered that well, Khaldun. Scripture is a wonderful thing, and if Jesus rose from the dead, we can know that Christianity is true. Period. It's game, set, match. You know, my mom died 7 years ago. My dad died 6 years ago,
Yes.
and although I studied the resurrection quite a bit to that point, it took on a new meaning to me, a deeper meaning to me at that time, because it gave me hope that I would see my parents again.
Mm.
Our family had a beloved dog who we had to put down a little over a year ago, and it just crushed us.
Okay.
And my wife will tell you that of our 33 years that we've been married, she's only seen me weep a handful of times. And she can also testify that I have wept more over the death of our dog last year than I had for all the other times put together.
Wow.
And it's not that I loved my dog more. It's because I don't have the assurance from Scripture that I'm ever going to see that dog again. And to think about holding that dog as they administered that the solutions that would put her down, and as you know, she died in my hands, and the vet put the stethoscope and said she's gone, and I thought, wow, just a minute ago she was alive. Her eyes were open. This is the same dog I'd played with and loved for 16 and a half years. I may never, ever see her again. And that was crushing. And I thought, if that's the way you feel about a dog, how about family members? Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through following, that he wanted to give us hope because we do not grieve as those who have no hope. Because those who have died in Christ, God will bring back with him at that second coming. And the trumpet will sound, the dead in Christ will be raised, and we're going to join them. And it's just awesome. Our loved ones, this is just a relatively brief period of time of which we're going to be separated from them. So, you brought up about the COVID-19 virus, and this has a lot of people concerned, and there are people dying. But you know what? As believers, we don't need to fear death. We can look forward to it, actually. We may not look forward to how we're going to die, but we don't have to fear death. And it's just awesome to think about eternal life, and it's guaranteed to us now because Christ was raised.
Amen, brother. Amen. Michael, thank you for all you're doing to articulate and to defend the gospel and the truth of the Scriptures. May your tribe increase, and may God bless you and your family.
Thank you, Khaldun, and thank you so much, brother, for what you're doing. What you're doing is important. Honored to be your friend.
It is. The honor is mine. Thank you, brother. Wow. This is going to be good. I'm going to